They're not here to answer questions live today, but myself and Marianne and Allison will be here to address questions after the recording is played. So thank you to all of those who have already sent questions with your registration. If you haven't sent a question yet, you can do so by typing your questions into the chat box in your Zoom toolbar at any time. And this is a closed chat, so only the HDSA panelists will be able to see what you've asked, and we'll address those questions at the end. So we do try to focus on questions with broad relevance and keep things anonymous rather than personal. So if we aren't able to get to your question today, you're welcome to reach out to HDSA and we're happy to help follow up. We are recording today, so if you want to watch this presentation later or send it to someone else, you can go to hdsa.org/researchwebinars, or you can go to HDSA's YouTube channel using the button at the top of our homepage, and it should be up in a few days. Okay, so let's watch as Dr. Eric Johnson hosts Dr. Walid Abisab and Dr. Sarah Tabrizi to share their perspectives on the AMT-130 results and address some key questions from the community. So I will stop sharing and hand it over to Manelli.
Hello to you all. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Eric Johnson. I'm the Chief Mission Officer at HDSA. We're here today to address the numerous questions and concerns that we have received at HDSA since UniQure shared the top-line data from the phase 1/2 study of AMT-130 for the treatment of Huntington's disease. We're excited to have Dr. Walid Abisab, Chief Medical Officer of UniQure, and Dr. Sarah Tabrizi, Professor of Clinical Neurology and the Director of the University College of London Huntington's Disease Center, join us today. Dr. Abisab and Dr. Tabrizi will talk about the news that was shared, and then we're all going to talk about what that means, both for the ongoing study and development of AMT-130 and what it means to people living with Huntington's disease. So, you know, this conversation is being recorded and it will be available to watch later on the HDSA YouTube channel, which you can access through the HDSA website at www.hdsa.org. In addition to this recording, you can find a lot of great resources on that website, such as links to our online support groups, research updates, community events, and more. This is an exciting opportunity for us to talk about some big news that was shared recently, and I'm really happy to have Walid and Sarah join us today. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to you two and start right from the get-go and just give us an update. Share some of what was shared previously, and then we'll start talking about it.
So this is Walid. I'll start first, just go through the data and turn it over to Sarah for her take on the data based on her decades of experience in that field and being a major strong voice in the academic world there. Essentially, really the take-home message for us is that the pre-specified primary analysis that we've agreed to with the FDA showed statistically significant 75% slowing of disease progression based on cUHDRS with p-values you can see here on the screen. What was also very strong support came from the statistically significant slowing based on TFC, total functional capacity, which is an important both clinical and regulatory endpoint. The biological or biomarker CSF NFL levels were below baseline at 36 months, which is also very supportive. And overall, from a safety and tolerability, AMT-130 continues to be generally well tolerated. So maybe we go through a little bit at a high level, and probably this community doesn't need me to talk to you a lot more about the disease progression, but When you think about this relentless progress of the disease, which leads ultimately to loss of jobs and loss of mobility, and later on further worsening of symptoms, when you think about what would it mean if you have a therapy that slows disease progression, this has to translate to an increase in the years of improved quality of life, and that is something that I think would be extremely motivating for patients if it turns out to be confirmed and supported. Again, I say this because we're excited we're sharing these data, but also these are data that based on top line results that still have to be discussed with the regulators and also published in peer-reviewed journals so that they can face the scrutiny that they deserve. But we're excited with what we're seeing so far. To give you a sense a bit about AMT-130, this is a potential for one-time administration with potential long-term effects. So we are really focused on the way we designed it to not take any shortcuts, essentially, and go truly deliver it in the parts of the brain that we know are mostly affected by this disease. And we do it with precision delivery under direct visualization. We look at it live as it's happening in the MRI to make sure that we're delivering the therapy to where it needs to go. It minimizes exposure systemically where it's not needed and maximizes the effect where it is needed. It's designed to suppress both the HTT, the wild, and the mutant one, which is toxic, but also the highly toxic exon 1 isoform. And Dr. Tabrizi has a lot to say about that as well. And the procedure with which we use to administer it is something that is broadly performed. You can think of, deep brain stimulation and Parkinson's disease, for example, where it's very commonly used. And many centers can actually deliver this type of procedure. Before I go and describe the details of the study, maybe we should take a moment to talk a little bit about the primary endpoint, which is the composite UHDRS. I feel very self-conscious talking about it with the person who took the lead in sharing a lot of that information, establishing why this is useful, but maybe just at a high level. The beauty of it is that it takes 4 core areas that are affected by the disease: the total functional capacity, which is a functional score looking at impairments in occupation, finance, the ability of activities of daily living; the motor symptoms with the total motor score that affect all parts of the body, but also 2 cognitive scores, which are very important, particularly early on in their disease, and use them in a composite. Use them in a way to generate a composite score, which has been shown repeatedly through a number of independent trials to be highly sensitive, essentially being sort of the early ones to show a signal and has an opportunity to be used as an early indicator of what's going to follow next. And it's been shown to be very sensitive to changes with multiple trials that you guys are quite familiar with. This is the analysis that we have proposed. Now, as you might know, we have studies going on in the US and in Europe. The study that we proposed to the agency was to use the totality of the data from these studies and compare the high dose cohort, where we treated 17 patients, and the low dose cohorts where we treated 12 patients, to the external natural history database, which is Enroll-HD, which is a very large database. And by the way, I want to thank CHDI for making that available. I want to thank the tens of thousands of patients and their families and people living with HD who contributed to that natural history, because without you having done that, we would not be able to do any of the analysis that we're doing today. So we used this comparison, and we used a statistical technique that's called propensity score methodology, which is a way that will take essentially 2 groups that are different and be able, through a statistical technique, choose the ones from the control group that best match the people in our trial so that we can compare them in a statistically sound way. And this is a methodology that's been used multiple times to do that, and the regulators have used it to approve therapies also as well. The primary endpoint in the analysis, as I mentioned, is cUHDRS, including as secondary endpoints, all the 4 domains, as I mentioned before, and the neurofilament light chain is a supportive endpoint. And I'll walk you through the data over the next few slides. Before we start looking at the data themselves, this shows you how well matched the 2 groups are after we apply this propensity score methodology. So you see on the right-hand side in gray, the selected patients, the 940 patients compared to the 17 in our trial, and how well they matched on the variety of endpoints that we looked at. The bolded ones are the ones where we included in the model to select, to be able to generate this matching. So in general, you see a very strong match between the 2 groups. The only potential exception is the region where in our trial, approximately 60% of the patients were from North America, from the US, whereas in the Enroll-HD database, 30% were from the US. And here we show the primary endpoint. So this is the primary statistically defined endpoint that was reviewed and aligned with the FDA and submitted with the FDA before we did the analysis. And here you can see that after 3 years, in those people who are left untreated with Enroll-HD, they lose about 1.5 points on the cUHDRS, whereas those in our trial, they lose about 0.38. This is from the totality of the data that we have using a technique called MMRM. It's a statistical technique that takes all the data from our patients, as well as all the data from the controls, starting with 940 and finishing up with 568, as you see on the slide. And that demonstrates a very highly statistically significant result with a p-value of 0.003. In this slide, we show the time course of how people progressed over time. And as you can see in gray, people who are left untreated with Enroll-HD, you can see how they essentially have a worsening of approximately 0.5 point per year, leading to about 1.5 points at 3 years, whereas those who receive AMT-130, you see them at 12-month, 24-month, and 36-month, how they are separating, and it does appear like the longer we continue to follow our treated subjects, the wider that gap is looking between them and the matched control. The next slide is virtually a repeat of what I said before, but for TFC. As I mentioned, TFC is an important endpoint. It measures functions. It tends to be a bit less sensitive because it changes by 1 point at a time, and the maximum score is 13. But each drop by 1 point is really meaningful because that would mean an inability to carry a full-time job or inability to balance your finances or take care of yourself. And as you see, after about 3 years, patients who are not treated lose almost 0.9 points, whereas those who receive AMT-130 lose 0.36, and that translates to a 60% reduction in this disease progression. This also was statistically significant with a p-value less than 0.05, as we show on the screen. And the next slide shows the time course. Again, you see patients lose gradually over time, a lower score with TFC, with about 0.9 towards 3 years, whereas those who receive AMT-130, depicted in the orange lines here, tend to be relatively stable over time, after they drop a little bit. And then again, like we see with cUHDRS, that gap is actually widening over time. This slide essentially shows the other 3 components of the cUHDRS. The one on the left, SDMT, the cognitive score was reduced by 88%, but it missed statistical significance at p of 0.057. As a result, the subsequent ones, and that's what they have the asterisk next to them, statistically, we cannot call them statistically significant. We have to call them nominal p-values because we essentially broke down that chain, so to speak, with the SDMT missing the p-value. But still, you would see that across the board, when we look at the Stroop, when you look at TMS, The changes all favor AMT-130 with a reduction as low as 59% and as high as 113% in the case of this group, with the nominal p-values you see at the bottom. The next slide here, I show you the low dose. Here, the results were a bit more variable. So what we see is on TFC and Stroop, we have anywhere between 68 and 30% and 68% approximately improvement in favor of AMT-130 low dose, whereas SDMT and TMS were favoring control, 60 to 90%. And overall, cUHDRS were virtually unchanged when we looked at this. So we look at this as a potentially an indicator that the low dose is at the lower end of the dose range. And as a result, the results, I apologize for the repeating same thing. Consequently, the results are not as consistent across all of these endpoints, but still we think that there is some signs of biologic activity that we're seeing with the low dose. And now I move to NFL. NFL is a well-known biomarker for anything that leads to neuronal cell death. And it's well known that due to the continued neurodegeneration that is observed in Huntington disease, NFL levels increase over time. And there's a number of papers that looked into this and have shown that on average, you would expect NFL to increase by about 10 to 15% per year. NFL is not specific for Huntington. It's elevated in a number of other diseases like ALS and multiple sclerosis and Alzheimer's disease. But it's very sensitive to anything that actually causes neurons to die and to be sick. And because they burst and then they release NFL, and we can measure it in the CSF. So it's very surprising for us and supportive that we see that NFL is reduced in the patients that we treated, received the AMT-130, both the low and the high dose, after 3 years, where you should expect them to be anywhere between 10, maybe 30 to about maybe 45%, if you think of that 10 to 15 per year number that we talk about. And the fact that we see them both below baseline at 3 years is something very supportive biologically, and most likely is an indicator that actually neuronal cell death is slowing down or potentially stopped. And that's why we're seeing what we're seeing right now. Let me move on to safety, and I'm almost done. For our safety, we continue to see a same picture that we've seen before, but now we've accumulated more data. AMT-130 remains generally well tolerated, and the safety profile is manageable at both doses. The majority of the drug-related serious adverse event occurred within the first few weeks post-treatment and fully resolved with either steroids, a short course of steroids, or symptomatic therapy. Since December of 2022, so it's almost 2.5 years now, it's actually more, we have not had any new drug-related serious adverse events, despite the fact that we treated now a total of about 45 patients who received active therapy with AMT-130. The next slide I include for completeness, because again, we should, for balance, I talked a lot about efficacy, we should give safety also time. But this slide, which I don't expect you to delve into the details, but has all the information, you can clearly see that the majority of the adverse events that we've seen were related to procedures, either headaches following the procedure itself, or due to lumbar punctures that we have to do repeatedly in the setting of a trial. And that's what we see as most of the adverse events, as you see at the bottom. And in terms of treatment-related adverse event, there were some SAEs that we've previously reported on, 4 in the high dose, which were due to some brain swelling. And those responded quickly, as I said before, to either a short course of supportive therapy, like analgesics, or like pain medication or anti-nausea medication, or a short course of steroids. So in terms of what we're going to do next, we are really gearing forward to and looking forward to have a meeting with the FDA in the fourth quarter, where we're going to be discussing plans to submit the BLA. We have had several meetings with the FDA before, and all of these next steps have been aligned with and agreed to with the FDA. And we're moving forward towards meeting with them so that we can maximize the chances that our dossier that we're going to be submitting to them will be successful. And we expect to submit that BLA in the first quarter of next year. And we will also request a priority review, which shortens the review time by approximately 2 months. And that's our plan. So with my last slide, I will just virtually summarize what I said. This analysis that we conducted with this ongoing study has been pre-specified with the FDA. We're excited to share the data that we have, that we meet both the primary on cUHDRS with 75% slowing, on TFC as well with 60% slowing. We're also very encouraged by the fact that all the other subdomains of cUHDRS, as I showed you, are moving in the right direction in the high dose. The CSF NFL being below baseline is supportive. What I haven't yet talked about, but I could mention here, is that we've run a number of different sensitivity analyses. Those are different ways that we can analyze the data that would be essentially, if they show consistent results, that means those results are robust. And those analyses were done, and they were generally consistent with the primary analysis that I shared with you. All of this will be shared with the FDA, of course. And on the safety front, AMT-130 continues to be generally well tolerated with manageable safety profile, and we're very pleased with what we've seen so far. Now, before I turn it over to Dr. Tabrizi, it's very important, as exciting as these data are, that we don't get ahead of our skis, so to speak. It's very important for us as a company also to be very responsible with the way we communicate this message. This is an ongoing study. The analysis was done for the 17 patients who are in the trial, 3 of whom are still ongoing. And the data, those who reached 12 months at the high dose were only, 36 months at the high dose were only 12 patients. So we need to keep that in mind. Having said that, all the indicators are exciting, encouraging, and that's why we're sharing it with you. That's why the health authority is willing to review the data and consider it for approval. But until we've had those further discussions, it's always the right thing to do to be cautiously optimistic. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Tabrizi.
Thank you, Walid. And I think I'll echo what Walid has said. I've worked in Huntington's disease. I know many of you. I've worked in the field for nearly 30 years in both research and clinical care. And I am cautiously optimistic about these results. And I think they give hope, genuine hope, to our patients and families affected by Huntington's disease. And I'll tell you why. So as Walid mentioned, we measure disease progression in Huntington's disease using the measure called the Composite United Huntington's Rating Scale and the Total Functional Capacity. And as Walid mentioned, they were both agreed in advance with the FDA. And the measure, the cUHDRS, it does capture multiple domains that are important to the disease. There's motor, cognitive and thinking, and neurological function. And the total functional capacity assesses decline in functional capacity, ability to work, manage money, perform daily self-care. And in Huntington's disease, those scales decrease over time, and they capture the combined worsening of motor, thinking, and function. And we know that that decline is closely linked to the loss of independence and daily function. The results are important, and I'll tell you why. It is in the 12 patients at high dose who completed 3 years, in those patients, there was, compared to the external comparator group, a 75% slowing of disease progression as measured by the composite Huntington's rating scale, and a 60% reduction in total functional capacity in those 12 people. And as Walid mentioned, the external group is the propensity score matched data from the CHDI Enroll-HD study, which many of you are part of and which has been critically important. I think the results suggest that AMT-130 has the potential to slow disease progression in Huntington's disease. The study, I have to be cautious in that the study was 12 people who had reached 3 years. But all of the measures, as Walid showed, are all going in the same direction. There is not a measure that looks like it's going in an opposite direction that sometimes we don't understand. In every measure is going in the same direction of improvement compared to the matched external comparator group. The other aspect of the data, I think in 12 people, again, it's very small numbers, but there's two aspects to the data I think is important. One is Huntington's disease is a slow progressive disease. We know that. It makes trials challenging. And these data are over 3 years. So over 3 years, this is the best possible chance to see over a relatively long period of time, which is not usually followed for that length of time in clinical trials in Huntington's disease, is that they really do show a separation from the graphs in that the external control group, as expected, continues to decline, but those on AMT-130 declined significantly slower in those 12 people. The other part of the data that gives me confidence that these data are real is the CSF neurofilament. And as Walid mentioned, this is a marker of neuronal health in the brain. And in early symptomatic disease, in the patients that were treated in this group, normally with the disease, we use that as a biomarker of disease progression. And it goes up, as Walid mentioned, over a 3-year period, we would expect in that group of patients to go up by between 30 and 45%. In those subjects, their CSF neurofilament, in those 12 subjects, their CSF neurofilament was lower than their original baseline, even taking into account the surgery, which for me really showed you molecular evidence that you can't, that's absolutely objective, that brain cells were being saved. So I think the data together with the clinical slowing and the neurofilament gives, I think, evidence that this therapy is slowing the disease in those 12 people. Does that mean it will have the same effect for everyone? We don't know. These are ongoing questions, and we will learn more as the program moves forward. I think the important aspect of these results is that they are a critical proof of principle for the field. I've looked at lots of clinical trial data over the years, and this was what we call, the FDA gave this word for it, a pivotal study, in that it was agreed in advance with the FDA, and the primary and secondary and exploratory endpoints were all pre-agreed. And the study met all of those endpoints. And I think it's a really important proof of principle result. We've understand much more about the disease biology, and I think for the first time, I've seen convincing evidence that the course of Huntington's disease can be modulated in these people. And that was something that gave me great hope, genuinely has given me hope, because I think these data suggest that Huntington's disease has become treatable. And I think for the community, this is a giant step forward. I think much more than other data we've seen, and I'll talk about that in the Q&A, but these data after 3 years with the supportive evidence from neurofilament, a marker of nerve health, I think these data suggest that the Huntington's disease in early symptomatic people now can be treatable.
Waleed, Sarah, thank you so much for that. Truly appreciate you sharing this information with us and with the larger community. And again, just want to say thank you for making the time to be here with us today. And I would love to turn it over to an opportunity for some question and answer. At HDSA, one of our
Quick question from me. Do I still share my slides?
Oh, Waleed, yes.
Can I
Absolutely stop sharing your screen at this point. We'll just we'll make this part more of a conversation now. Thank you. At HDSA, it's important for us to make sure that people living with HD are informed about what is happening in research. Another important responsibility for us is to make sure that people doing research are hearing from you, the people living with Huntington's disease. Since UniQure's announcement, we have received numerous questions and concerns from people in the community. We hope to address as many of those as we can today. We're also happy to take any questions that you might have. You can utilize the Q&A feature in Zoom for that. We've received a lot of questions through our social media postings, through the HDSA Social Worker Network and our helpline, through the HDSA Centers of Excellence, and directly from people in the HD community. And while we're going to try to get through as many as we can today, we know we're not going to be able to get to them all. If you weren't able to ask your question, if you didn't hear an answer to your question, please send it in to us. We're going to continue to work with the team at UniQure, and we'll share information along the way as we can and are able to do so. So again, just want to say we've received a lot of questions. We hope to address as many as possible, but the reality is that we can't get to them all, but we're going to ask that you continue to send it our way. So that's kind of the overview. Waleed, Sarah, I'm going to start sharing some of these questions and appreciate your all's answers on this. I would just kind of frame this by saying, you know, as we talk about these questions today, as we dig into this a little bit more, I'm hoping you can help us understand really in big picture terms what these study results actually mean for the HD community, both in terms of the scientific significance, as you've talked about, and really what people can realistically expect regarding access, next steps, etc. So one thing that has come up numerous times, and I hope you both will be able to address this. Waleed, I think I'll start with you, and then I'll ask Sarah to add commentary to it as well, is the HD community has faced setbacks in research and clinical trials before. We've had promising treatments in front of us that their trials didn't go as hoped. Given that history and kind of knowing where people are coming from, how confident are you that, you know, what you've seen so far, the benefits that you've seen in the trial so far, are going to hold up in a larger, more rigorous trial?
Yeah, so it's a very good question, Eric, and I think this is where we have to be very responsible and balanced with the way we discuss these things, and sometimes the excitement takes over, and we see these data and we're excited about them. But again, I want to re-emphasize that what we're looking at are data from a relatively small number of subjects, as Sarah just mentioned before. You know, 12 of these subjects received the high dose and reached the 36-month time point, which is the primary endpoint time point for analysis. So we have to be somewhat cautious in interpreting the results. Having said that, we really are encouraged by these pivotal study results. I mean, the consistent findings that I talked about, not just on clinical and functional endpoint, but also on the biologic biomarker of NFL. It's really important, and I think Sarah mentioned that before, to keep in mind that what we are looking at are not necessarily a short time, evidence of maybe a biomarker that's linked to the disease. We're observing these people over a 3-year period. And over those 3 years, we're also looking with the primary endpoint being a very important clinical endpoint. The composite score and all of its components, but also TFC, which in and by itself is an important functional endpoint. So that really carries a lot of weight. I can tell you over the past 9 months, we've engaged extensively and constructively with the FDA, and we've reviewed these data with them, not the data themselves, but we reviewed the plans for how we want to analyze them, which natural history we will compare to, why, with a very systematic approach, and give them a lot of rationale for why we're doing what we're doing. And they gave us feedback, which we incorporated and essentially submitted to them. And we followed the same path. And we're confident that now with these results that we have in hand, that the FDA will essentially take a look at these data, examine them in the details, and we're looking forward to be able to have that discussion with them. In the meantime, we're continuing to accumulate data. We have people who are treated who will continue to accumulate data. Those that I've shared data with you, we will continue to share more data. We're going to follow them at least for a total of 5 years, but also there are some others that are continuing in the trial. So, yeah.
Thanks, Walid. Sarah, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think Walid's answered most of the points that I was going to make. You're absolutely right. The Huntington's community has faced setbacks. We have all faced setbacks. And drug development is really tough. That's and in Huntington's disease, it's tough as well because the disease doesn't progress really rapidly. And so the trials for Huntington's disease have to last years. And in the past, the disappointments we have had are related to all different underlying reasons. So what we need for the community is we have had a lot of tough setbacks. But I think this is genuinely some good news and a ray of light. And it tells us two big things. It tells us much more about the disease. It tells us about the biology of the disease. It tells us and informs us about clinical trials. And it is a therapy that may benefit more people than the 12 people who were treated. And that's where we are now. And we owe it to the community, to all of you, to take it forward and test it in much larger numbers. I need to just, one final point. In gene therapy trials, numbers are typically very small. In other sorts of trials with a pill or with an intrathecal lumbar puncture delivered therapy, you can study larger numbers. But gene therapy trials are traditionally small. And traditionally, they are not with a big placebo arm because it's not really ethical to keep someone for 3 years and for them to have invasive brain surgery, keep them for 3 years, and then see if there's a difference. So using the external a comparator group from Enroll is a way that many gene therapy drugs have been approved before with external natural history data. So the study was designed to the best of that type of study. It does have small numbers, but that's the nature of gene therapy. It does have an external control group, but that's the nature of gene therapy. But what it tells us is there is a signal that more convincing than other data that has been much shorter periods, that this, after 3 years, this approach has slowed significantly the disease in those people with the high dose. And I think those data mean that we have to try and get this therapy to as many people in the community as we can and use the information, the science that we've learned to develop therapies that can be given to everyone worldwide, regardless of income, where you are. And that's what this study will tell us as well. This therapy was targeting exon 1, a highly toxic protein, and it was targeting the full-length mutant Huntington. This was the first therapy targeting both of those toxic species, and I think that's important. And so that tells us a lot as well, and we will use that information to move forward and enable therapies that can be given to everyone that follow this model. So sorry, long answer, but really, really important question.
No, Sarah, thank you so much. And I think you touched on a number of things, and some of these are going to come up in some of our further questions. You'd mentioned earlier the idea of proof of principle, and it sounds like, you know, what part of what you just shared is data from this trial is showing that this mechanism is working, right?
Absolutely.
However, as you've also mentioned and Walid has shared as well, this is a small data set. This is a small sample of people living with Huntington's, and there's more to be learned. You're learning it over time with the people who are already participating, and you're looking to expand upon that so that we can learn even more. Something that I often think about, and I know we talk about it in many different ways, is this idea that clinical trials are still trials, and they need to go through completion to see whether or not they're doing what the goal of the trial is. And
Absolutely.
while this is an exciting readout of data at 3 years in this group of 12, there's still more data to be gathered, more trial to conduct. So appreciate all of these things you've said. You also touched on things like accessibility and availability of drug, and we'll get to that with some further questions, but just wanted to emphasize that those are things that we've been hearing and you've already started to touch upon. I think as we're still thinking about the process, what's in front of you now at UniQure and for AMT-130, Walid, I guess I would ask you to start. How much can you share about what the overall time frame might look like and what the next steps are for a trial like this?
So the trial is ongoing. As I said before, we're going to continue to collect data and you know, both safety and efficacy, and that's how it is from the clinical conduct point of view. But the most important element that we can do would be to be laser sharp focused on taking the next step and submitting the BLA for review by the FDA. So this whole process started when we applied for and obtained what they call the RMAT designation, which is back in March of 2024. That gives us a much closer interaction with the FDA, much faster access. That was followed by a series of meetings, November of 2024, and 2 meetings, one in March of 2025 and one in April, focus respectively the March on the CMC, the product quality, and all those elements to make sure that we're manufacturing it the correct way and the way that the FDA is going to support, and what data we need to provide in the BLA for them to be able to verify that, and the clinical aspect. What are we going to be comparing to? Enroll-HD in this case. How we're going to doing the procedure, propensity score methodology with the various sensitivity, the primary endpoint, so on and so forth. And now we lock the database as we were planning and share the top line results with you, because again, these are very material information for the company like us that is relatively small, and these data have an important implication financially for the company, because we're publicly traded. We have to share that information. So some people might say, well, why did you share it with us early before we talked to the FDA? We have to. We cannot not share the data. Then very quickly we go and meet with the FDA and say, look, these are the data. This is what we propose to submit as part of the BLA. This is the format with which we plan to do it. There are some checking the boxes kind of thing as to how you do it, how you want to show the safety, so on and so forth. We agree on those parameters, and when we go forward and submit the BLA, and we're asking also for priority review, because this program will meet the criteria, unmet medical need, in a very serious illness like Huntington. And we're doing everything we can to make sure that we do it as quickly as possible, and we get the priority review so that we can get ultimately go through the review process next year and potentially get approval and have the drug available potentially to patients by the end of next year, approximately, if you look at the timeline. So this is what we are really focused on. So while the study is ongoing and still collecting data, but the most important part is to move forward with our interactions with the FDA and be able to get it to the finish line.
Waleed, thank you so much for talking a bit about what the regulatory process is. This is something I think the larger community can benefit from learning more about, but I also recognize how complex that is. And what you just shared in an answer to this question, I think, gives a good overview of your approach and what you're dealing with right now. I would just like to add that, as people hear you talk about a potential timeline, we recognize you still have to work with a government agency, and we know that their schedules are not always carved in stone, right? So these are projections based on the work you've done, based on what you know as a company, but we recognize that you're still dealing with an agency that has to issue a decision before anything can move forward, right? Well, and I appreciate you saying that, and I appreciate you letting me follow up with that, just because, again, your proposed timeline is exciting, but it is tempered by the fact that you deal with sources outside of your control and important processes, right, for anything to become available for people to have as a treatment, but to recognize it's a complex process, right?
That's right.
Something you both mentioned that I hope you can touch on briefly is in this study, and as Sarah said, in many gene therapy studies, you're using an external control. Can you mention briefly, just again, say what that external control is, and how does that differ from a placebo control?
Right. I mean, placebo control usually is the state-of-the-art way to compare, right? You get people on trial, you do it what they call double blind, where neither the patient nor the doctor treating them, and actually it's more than double blind, it's triple blind, nor the sponsoring company knows what these people are given. It could be the active therapy or what we call placebo, which is the inactive form of the drug, and it's done in a way that you won't know. And that would be the easiest way to be able to say, okay, is the actual ingredient that we put in the pill or whatever therapy that we're giving, is it producing the effects that we want? However, there are some certain situations, and Sarah went through it before, gene therapy is one of them, where it is not either ethical or feasible. Ethical is a difficult discussion because people's ethics are different and people can have debates around this, but it's also is not feasible. When people enter in a trial, they are most of the time, almost all the time, not allowed to enter into other trials or get therapy that would change the underlying disease. So essentially, you're asking them to commit to your study. And then if you are giving them an inactive substance, placebo, or you're doing some sham procedure to them, they will be locked in for as long the trial is needed. And as we have shown, because we're trying to study patients in the early stages of Huntington disease, as a result, you need to observe people for longer periods of time to be able to start seeing clearly that there's a difference if they were left untreated versus if they received your therapy. And because gene therapy is such specialized type of therapy that requires also, in our case, this the procedure to administer the therapy directly to the deep structures of the brain, it really does not lend itself to doing the usual placebo-controlled trials. And therefore, people who receive our therapy need to know that they're actually getting the active therapy and not live in the hope that maybe I got the therapy and now I invested 3 years of my life and turns out that I didn't get it. That would be really difficult. And I don't think we will be able to recruit that trial. We will have very few patients who would be willing to volunteer to be part of our trial. Luckily, the field has been moving steadily and recognizing those challenges and benefiting from using the external controls. And I can talk a lot about this. There's a great scientific reason for why one would use external natural history control, because you could also generate a lot of data even after approval and compare your therapy to those, because that is the real life, really what matters. When we do trials, we try to simulate a little bit what real life is and trying to figure out whether our medicine works, but our therapies are better tested actually in real life. So the field of being able to compare different groups is really has advanced dramatically, and statistically, there's been major breakthroughs in that space. And I can tell you, based on personal experience, I was very naive to this like 2 years ago. Now, I had a quick study as a result of the work that we've done, and I can tell you it's unbelievably powerful. We have looked at other natural history databases, which are great and complementing, like Track and Predict and others, and Enroll HD, and we use these criteria to identify who from those groups will match our subjects. And virtually all the time, we end up with a very similar estimate of what is the annual decline that we see on cUHDRS and TFC, because we try to get the people who look like our patients. Our patients are likely to progress that way, and that's why no matter where we go and search for those, whether it's Enroll or Track and Predict, we end up with the same answer. To me, this is very robust. And I can tell you, the regulatory agency, the FDA, has their statisticians have published on this. It's even on the website of the FDA, and they have guidances along this. So we're lucky that we have that opportunity with us, and therefore we employed it. Again, in lockstep with the FDA, we pre-specified it, and we ran the analysis, and that's what you're seeing. So there's always going to be some questions that people would have, or could there be some benefit that you got a little bit more with this or that? Those are fair questions to ask. Those are debates that we need to have academically in peer-reviewed journals. But I will tell you, when you look at the magnitude of the effect, when you look at the effect over 3 years, when you look at the time course, it's really very difficult to explain that away by just, you're not doing the right comparison, or those are not the right people, right? Because if you look at the natural level of decline of people who participate in Enroll HD and who meet our inclusion criteria in the trial, they go much faster. Once we apply our selection to match our patients exactly on all of those domains that I showed you, you get almost half as fast a decline. So in other words, we're not comparing to the average Enroll HD population or the average Enroll HD that meet the early stages of our disease. We're looking at those specifically that match our patients, and that's even less. And again, this should also give us comfort that we're not choosing a low hurdle to cross. So I can speak tons more about this, but I will not.
Waleed, I appreciate that. And again, thank you for that insight into what an external control means, but also why it's important for a study like this and how the regulatory agencies like the FDA look at it. I want to shift our conversation a little bit to concepts and questions around access and logistics, right? As this is an ongoing trial, how can people still participate in the trial?
Yeah, so the main trial has now actually finished recruiting, but again, those things could change. We're in discussion with the FDA. There could be new trials or new cohort within the same trial that will be starting. So I would advise people to stay in close contact with HDSA, that we and then continue to monitor on clinicaltrials.gov. We include that information. There is a cohort of 6 patients who otherwise would not have met our criterion based on the volume of the striatum. This trial, if you go on clinicaltrials.gov, it will show that it still is recruiting, but I can tell you it's been oversubscribed, so to speak, and now we most likely have had all the patients that would meet the criteria, and we're probably going to be stopping that. So I don't want to be giving people false hopes that there is something that is available right now. But that doesn't mean that we will not be able to to have such a thing in the future, and people should remain on the lookout.
I appreciate that, and I think the takeaway is, while the trial is enrolled, stay tuned, keep paying attention, and if something becomes available, you will share it, and we'll make sure that the community is informed.
That's right.
I want to ask a question that's kind of a forward-looking question, both about UniQure's AMT-130 study, but then also kind of what it means for drugs that are in clinical trials that are aiming to become clinical treatments. If a treatment gets approved, who might be eligible at first? And how might that change over time?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think this is driven predominantly by the label. You know, any drug that gets approved, there's a label that the FDA will, I'm talking about the US specifically now, the FDA will, I mean, it would be also similar to Europe, but it would not be the FDA, it would be EMA, will tell you who would be the patients that will meet who are appropriate to be treated with this therapy. So for us right now, it's really premature to have that discussion without having that debate with the FDA. Now, often this tends to be generally similar to the people that you studied in your study. And as you know, we've included patients in our trial who are currently would be classified as HDSS stage 2 towards the second part of it, and early stage 3. But again, I don't want to go beyond that because it's really not appropriate to discuss this without having had the final label discussion with the FDA. And usually that comes towards the end before you get approval.
Waleed, thank you. I appreciate that. Sarah, I hope you don't mind. I'm going to ask you that question, but I'll ask you to, you know, you're a clinician. You're sitting with someone who's coming in and saying, hey, I know this is happening. Can I get this treatment? How do you, and again, I know I'm asking you to be hypothetical and think forward, but how do you have this conversation with people in clinic?
It's a very good question. So I've been talking to lots of patients and families in the last 2 weeks, and both in email and face-to-face. So a number of things. As Waleed mentioned, we don't know what the FDA will say in their meeting. We're hopeful, but it's difficult. We don't know what that outcome will be. So, but what I have been saying to people is this is really the beginning. I genuinely think it's the beginning of a disease-modifying therapies for Huntington's disease. I think it's important for the ongoing studies. They're all going to tell us something. They are all really important, all of the different other therapies being tested. But these results tell us that this therapy in those people targeting what we know as all the toxic forms of Huntington slows disease. We will, and I've been saying to people, is do everything we can within our power to get this therapy to everyone who is able to get it, who the regulators approve getting it. So access will be something that us as clinicians, and we'll be working with UniQure and the bodies that approve this in each country to get this to as many people as possible. Will this get to everyone? It'll be difficult. It'll be difficult worldwide. It's an invasive therapy. It requires a neurosurgical procedure, and this is why the study is small, and I mentioned earlier. But what this gives us is enormous scientific insights and clinical insights into what disease modification looks like. It's a small number of people, but everything went in the right direction. The composite Huntington's rating scale and the TFC both went in the same direction, supported by the biomarkers. Everything went in the right way. So what that tells us is, as I mentioned earlier, that Huntington's disease, we now know, can be modified, the course of it. So that tells us something really important. That gives enormous hope because this therapy we will try and get to as many people as possible, including everyone in the US and the Europe and everyone who's eligible. We will also go back to the drawing board and be developing therapies, and there are ongoing studies that help answer questions about the science. What we need to target, when we need to target, how we need to target, how long studies need to be, what do biomarkers tell us. So this is like a door has opened, and we now have much more information. Every trial tells us something. Failed trials, we learn from. Successful trials, we learn from. And that's what we're going to do with these results to make sure we can get therapies that can be given to everyone. This therapy and what's moving forward for the future. So I think it's a real time of hope, but we need to keep people hopeful. We're cautiously optimistic, but we need to be realistic in how quickly we can get these therapies. And that's when we're dependent on regulatory bodies like the FDA and other bodies. But that process is starting. UniQure will be working very hard. We'll be working with the patients and families and all the doctors and centers to try and get this therapy to as many people as we can, whilst working on more therapies coming through.
Sarah, I appreciate that. And I appreciate that you underlined the fact that we are always learning more about the disease and how these potential therapies affect it, but that's an ongoing process, right?
Absolutely.
I will say, and I appreciate your answer to this question, I know based on what people in the community have talked about, there were people who wanted to be a part of this trial who couldn't participate in the trial because of their stage of disease. So I think people are asking these questions saying, hey, if I wasn't able to be a part of the trial, am I going to be potentially available for, or am I going to potentially be able to access that treatment? And that's a question that there's still so much to be learned, but how do you address that kind of immediately?
It's a very important question, and I've been asked the same question over the last 2 weeks in a large amount of communications I've had with my patients and families. I think it's a very understandable question. When you do a clinical trial, it's a bit like, I mean, I run a lab as well, so it is a scientific experiment, and that's why there's p-values and statistical analysis. So you're doing a scientific experiment, and the scientific experiment is, will this intervention change something compared to what your control group is? And the results in this case were statistically significant, which means the statistical significance really reinforces that in those 12 patients, it's a small number of people, but the result is very likely to be real. And as I say, I mentioned supported by CSF neurofilament data. But does that mean we can get the drug to everyone with Huntington's disease? That's where the challenge comes in, and that's where the regulators, they will, the FDA, for example, we will discuss with the FDA to see which patients are included in the product label, and we will work with all the people, that the public, the families, the payers, to try and get this to as many people that would be eligible according to what the regulators tell us. Does this mean if you've got later disease or earlier disease than those people in the study, you cannot get the treatment? It doesn't mean that. It means for the beginning, we will probably be similar to the cohort that was treated. But ongoing data will be collected, ongoing studies will happen, there will be ongoing monitoring, and there may be the possibility of testing this in some people with earlier stage disease, and potentially testing it if it's suitable for the surgery in people with later stage disease. And that's all future work. The first thing is to understand what the regulators will approve now. So there's a lot still to be done, and we're at the beginning of that process. And as we move forward, we will be working to try and get this to as many people as we can and to learn at the same time. I think it's very exciting news, and I think, as well, it said, the company had to present it in the way they had to because of the way companies work. So it was sudden news for all the patients and families, but it is good news. As I mentioned earlier, it is real hope, but hopeful news does come with anxieties because they're relating to will I get the drug? Will my family get the drug? Will my sister, my mother, and so on? So it's really important that we hear that. And the wonderful thing about the Huntington's community, and this is why I'm passionate about working in the Huntington's field, is we are all one community. The patients, the families, the doctors, the scientists, the companies. It's a rare disease. We all work closely together, and we are genuinely in partnership with the patients and families. So we will keep everyone informed as much as we can. We will bring you on the journey, and we will try and get this treatment to as many as possible. Those people who may not be eligible for the treatment in the future, we will be developing the next generation of drugs that do this, exactly what AMT-130 does, but that may possibly be given to everyone worldwide, even in developing countries. And so we have a lot of work still to do in Huntington's disease, but we're at a moment in the field where really for the first time, something has changed the course of the disease and made Huntington's disease potentially treatable. And I think that's where we are now. So it's very good news, but lots more to come.
I appreciate how you summarize that. This is very good news. There's a lot still to be learned and more to come, and then even more after that.
Absolutely.
I'm going to stop for 1 second and just say, I recognize that we're at time, but I'm wondering if you two might have approximately 10 more minutes.
Absolutely.
Answer.
Yeah, loads of time.
I can do 10 more minutes.
All right. I was like, I love that Sarah was just like, absolutely. And Waleed, you're sticking with me, but I want to be respectful of your time. Thank you so much for all of this. These are big answers to big questions. And I think one thing I'd like to know, and Waleed, I'll turn to you for this with the work that UniQure is doing, is how do you propose talking to the HD community in plain language so hope stays realistic, but people still feel hopeful as you go through this process in front of you?
Yeah, I think it's really important that we stay in constant dialogue in a way that we can describe what sometimes is a complex, highly scientific, as Sarah said, p-values and propensity score matching and all kind of stuff, into a language that you know, everybody can have access to and understand what is it that we mean. I think, you know, our commitment is to keep to be an active part of that community that Sarah described, the Huntington disease community, to do our share, to communicate with you openly and transparently about what is it that we're doing and where we are. So honestly, I think I don't want to be repeating what Sarah said. I think we have an important finding right now that truly for the first time is demonstrating that essentially reducing the Huntington protein, particularly the mutant type of the Huntington protein that is known, has been studied in a number of studies preclinically in animals and in humans, and has shown that if we reduce it as our therapy is supposed to do, we are seeing emerging data right now after 3 years that's clinically measurable endpoint, tangible endpoints that are showing that we're heading in that direction. And that is also backed biologically by certain markers that are meant to evaluate the health of our nerve cells that is also supporting this. And this is very exciting for the field, and it's going to be really be an impetus and an accelerator for many more studies and companies and universities and all sorts of funding to be able to better understand and push forward, because we almost we have a beachhead, and now we just need to be broadening from there. I think it's early days, but it's early good days, and there's going to be more to come. and maybe, you know, one can dream of a future where this becomes like not really a very big worry for people if they have this. That could be something that we can hope for, we can dream with, and hopefully we UniQure can be a contributor to this and be part of not just the beginning but the middle and the end of the story as well.
Exactly.
Waleed, I appreciate what you just said, and I think it's that dream of a future where people are living with HD differently. And as you are at the stage where you are with your work with UniQure right now, what does that look like for near future, mid future, and far future, right? And to recognize there are other players in the game too. So what does that mean for the potential future for people living with HD? I will say we get a lot of questions though from people about what can I do right now? What should I do right now? And Sarah, I'll ask you just for a brief answer as a clinician, when we get questions like, should I run out and get genetic testing today because of this?
Yeah, I've had a lot of those questions.
Should I be going to,
Yeah.
should I start being seen by a clinician? How do you answer that?
So getting involved helps make a difference. So all of those tens of thousands of people, and we have hundreds of those at our clinic in London, who have come up every year for their Enroll HD visit, have been absolutely critical to this result, as Walid has explained. So they are so people in Enroll are already doing their part. The volunteers in the study who bravely volunteered, when we first started the study, we didn't know, we were, the surgery, the therapy, it was very novel. And so the people who volunteered early in the study were very brave. And I think what this, I've been telling people is just get involved. Be an Enroll HD, go to do an Enroll visit. That's how we recruit for clinical trials. That's how we know who is available for research. Being an Enroll just means that you are ready for research. Genetic testing, I would say at this stage, if you had never thought about genetic testing for Huntington's disease, and that it was something that you didn't really want to do, I wouldn't yet rush out to get a genetic test. This is the beginning. We will learn more. As and when this and potentially other therapies get licensed, I think there'll be a different discussion about genetic testing then, because when we do counseling for genetic testing, we have to do the counseling for people who are at risk of the disease because they have an affected parent, or people who might be worried that they have some early signs of the disease. We, up until now, have really had to say, we're going to do the genetic test, but we don't have any treatments for you. And I think as we move forward, this will change, and there will be more reason to have a genetic test as therapies become available, this and potentially others. At this stage, is this a reason to rush out and get a genetic test to see if you carry the HD gene expansion? I would probably say no. Don't change what you had felt inside about your genetic testing. But what this does mean is in the future, we might be able to do genetic testing and say, if you have the Huntington's gene expansion, we can offer you a treatment. And that's where we are all working towards. And I think, like you've alluded to, Eric, and Walid has mentioned, Huntington's disease, we're in this together. This is a battle we are all fighting on behalf of our patients and families, who we really are very close to. What I think I go back to this quote from Churchill. So Churchill, as you know, in the Second World War was a very important statesman, and he did very good speeches. But he did a very good speech about halfway through the Second World War, which was, we're not at the end, but we may now be at the beginning of the end. And that's where we are now in Huntington's disease. And I think it's a huge step forward, and we've got much to be optimistic about, but we've got a lot of work ahead, and we will do it together with the patients and families and listen to them at every opportunity.
Thank you so much for that, Sarah. I think that's a fantastic It's a fantastic quote and shapes where we are as a larger HD community. I will add, just as a former clinician myself, this is something that I've been fielding where I will emphasize choosing your path forward in living with Huntington's disease is very personal and individualistic, but there are resources out there to help you make the best choice for yourself. Talking to a genetic counselor, talking to an HD specialist or someone at the HDSA Centers of Excellence Network. It can help people gather information to help them make the decision. To your point, now is not the time to make a rush choice, but it is a time to be informed. Talk to people who are experts in HD, talk to people connected with the community, listen to the experts at the companies like UniQure who are sharing news like this with us today. So I just want to say thank you both for being willing to stay on a few extra minutes, for all that you've shared today. Truly appreciate how many questions you were able to answer, but again, recognizing we haven't gotten to them all. So again, for people in the community, feel free to share your questions with us. We'll continue to work with UniQure to share information from them as they have it. I just want to remind people that this is exciting news, but it can bring mixed feelings, and there are resources available to help you with that. I will encourage everyone to check out the HDSA website, www.hdsa.org, to find the recording of this conversation, but also other resources that can help you as you are weighing out your options and possibilities at this time, like our support group network, our social work network, the HDSA COEs, and even just direct communications to us. And then I want to echo something that Sarah said, and I know Waleed has said this in the past too, and we all believe this. I want to give a big thank you to the people who are living with HD who participate in research. Because of you, trials like this and all others are moving forward, all of which is bringing us closer to a day when there is a treatment available for HD. Thank you all for your time. Waleed, Sarah, everyone watching, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks again for joining us today. I hope that you found the conversation with Waleed and Sarah insightful. I hope that some of your questions have been answered through that recording, but we do have some time for live Q&A to answer some of the questions that have come through the chat. So I am going to start this, and we will going. Just make sure that's okay. So we received hundreds of questions in the chat. Okay, so I hope you can appreciate we won't be able to get to every single one, but we really, really are just so excited about the engagement of this community, and thank you so much for being here and putting in your questions, and we will really try to address as many as possible. We're going to focus on the most common questions. And so I think it makes sense to start with, there were a lot of questions about the drug itself and the nature of the trial. So I'll try to address some of those, and then I'm going to hand it over to Marianne and Allison, and they can talk a little bit more about where and when it might become available and things about the cost and other things to think about. So let's just start a little bit about the drug and the trial. So just to reiterate, AMT-130 is this piece of genetic material packaged into a harmless virus and delivered to the part of the brain that's affected by HD, and this is done by brain surgery. And so these genetic instructions interfere with the production of the Huntington protein. So less of it is made, and that is what we call a Huntington lowering approach. Now, once those genetic instructions are delivered, they stay in the brain forever. So this is an irreversible procedure. And just to recap these latest results, in 12 people who received the high dose of the drug, after 3 years, UniQure has reported a 75% slowing of disease. And so we got some questions about what that means exactly. how that was measured. So this was measured using the CUHDRS, which is a composite score. It takes into account a number of things, including total functional capacity. So things like having trouble working, doing finances, chores at home, day-to-day living. It also looks at total motor score, which is problems with movement. And there are some cognitive tests to look at problems with thinking. So hopefully that answers that question. There were some questions in the chat about the other 5 people who received the high dose, because there were 17 and now 12 are at this 3-year endpoint. I don't have the details for those 5 individuals, but it may just be that they haven't reached the 3-year mark yet, and we'll be getting another data set at the next release. Maybe we'll see the data from those individuals. Another question is about several questions about the anticipated outcomes and whether this drug will slow disease progression. And so AMT-130 and other Huntington lowering approaches, they're all meant to slow disease progression. And I thought this might be a good opportunity to talk about the difference between a cure and a disease modifying treatment. So a cure would completely stop or even reverse a disease. On the other hand, a disease modifying therapy aims to slow or delay disease progression, and that, helping people maintain their abilities and their quality of life for longer. And so AMT-130, if it's successful, would fall into the second category of disease modifying therapy. There were some questions about side effects and adverse reactions. I know Walid covered it, but just to reiterate, so far it has been safe. There were some adverse reactions, and early on they actually had to pause the trial temporarily because a few people experienced some serious side effects, but they have since recovered, and the trial was resumed. And since then, there have been no new drug-related serious adverse events since 2022. So that's good news. Several questions about, is there any other way to deliver the drug? Is there other ways to get past the blood-brain barrier? Will this be available in a pill form? So AMT-130, as I said, and as Sarah mentioned, it's one of several Huntington lowering approaches. And while AMT-130 is a gene therapy, and gene therapies of this type require brain surgery, but there are several companies working on other approaches to reduce Huntington. Some of these will be in pill form, and some of them are delivered by a spinal tap or lumbar puncture. And so several of these are actually being tested in clinical trials right now. So although, AMT-130 may be the one that you've heard most because it was covered most by the media, there are other options coming down the pipeline. And so, UniQure, as Sarah said, is good. The UniQure news is good news for all Huntington lowering approaches. We got many questions about what stage the trial participants were and whether AMT-130 will be available for people at other stages or beneficial for people at all stages of disease. And I think both Walid and Sarah touched on this, but just by the sheer number of times it came up in the chat, I thought I would reiterate. Excuse me. So far, the therapy has only been tested in people with early symptoms of HD. So they mentioned late stage 2 and early stage 3. So when they say that, they're talking about the HD-ISS staging system. What that means, in real life, is that these folks have measurable symptoms, movement, thinking, and function symptoms, but their day-to-day function is still largely intact and they are, still independent. So that's the folks who were in the trial so far. If the FDA approves this drug, the eligibility will likely at first be for people that are similar to those individuals that were in the trial. Over time, further studies will explore, the drug in other people at different stages, maybe later stages, maybe pre-symptomatic stages. But it's not until those tests are done that we will really have an idea of who will benefit from the drug and what stage. And it's just really too early to tell right now. Okay, so I'll do one more question about sort of the nature of the drug, and then I'll hand it over to Marianne. So a few people asked about the CAG number and would the CAG number affect like how well this drug is working. This drug does not discriminate between different CAG lengths. So this one I wanted to bring up because it actually also touches on another question that came up a lot, which is how important is it to preserve the normal version of the Huntington protein? And so quick recap, we all have 2 copies of the Huntington gene, one inherited from mom, one from dad. Most people with HD have one normal copy of the Huntington gene and one expanded copy with the extra CAGs. And so the normal copy produces normal Huntington protein, which has various responsibilities in our cells, and we wouldn't necessarily want to get rid of it altogether. This was a very important question back before we had so many clinical trials testing Huntington lowering in people. But so far, thankfully, in several ongoing trials that have reduced both copies of the Huntington protein, they've been safe so far. And so it argues that you can lower both copies safely, at least on the scale of a few years. Having said that, other companies like Wave and Vico are actually going after just lowering or preferentially lowering the expanded copy. And so more options are coming down the pipeline. So that kind of, I think, covers the most common questions about the drug itself and the trials and who's eligible. By far, the next biggest question was about where and when the drug will be available. I think that would probably sum that up, right, Marianne? So I'm going to hand it over to Marianne to talk about that.
Yeah, so a lot of questions that have been coming into the chat, but also when everybody registered, thank you for submitting your questions, and also just like through the community to us at national and I'm sure on local levels have been like access, like can I access this drug right now? Can I go to my local neurologist? And the answer is no, right? There's no enrollment right now for the current clinical trial. They're fully enrolled. They have another cohort that they are going to do the procedure on, the surgery on, and that is fully enrolled as well. In best case scenario, UniQure is planning to meet with FDA in early 2026. So best case scenario, everything goes well. FDA is like, yes, we want this as an accelerated approval process, which an accelerated approval process is when the FDA's process is patients with certain serious illnesses they're showing new treatments that show promising early data and they show benefit. So while the longer term clinical trials will continue to show safety and effectiveness, they will approve it for that within that initial data. So if that goes through, FDA is like, yes, go forth with it. The earliest that it would be potentially an option would be probably end of 2026, early 2027. So that's sort of when. where this is a, significant 12-hour brain surgery, and only certain places in the United States that I'm aware of have this special MRI machine that allow the team of specialists that work together with the neurosurgeon to provide this surgery will also work with a team at like an HDSA center of excellence, because there will need to be aftercare and follow up afterwards for a long period of time to make sure everything is safe and effective. So that will mean that people are going to have to travel potentially if there's not a site close by. Will this be potentially available in the future at other sites with or will other universities or institutions have these machines, or will be able to work further? That's something that we don't have the answers to just yet. And I
Thanks,
think,
Marianne.
yeah.
I think that sums it up nicely. You know, like Walid and Sarah, they're very excited, and they talked about this being, I think Walid mentioned it being similar to deep brain stimulation for Parkinson's. I don't know that if that's the case. I don't know what the how many places you can get deep brain stimulation for Parkinson's. But the fact is, it's a significant procedure. I'm hopeful that if the data continues to be positive, we'll make it happen. We want to get this drug out to as many people as possible, but we got to stay realistic. Another huge hurdle and another very frequent question in the chat was about the cost of these drugs. Allison, did you want to touch on that?
Yeah, and before I talk about cost, this question came up a lot too. Is the current government shutdown going to impact the FDA process? And if UniQure isn't submitting their proposals until 2026, probably not. But the reality is, because the government has currently shut down, any applications that were going to be submitted now are going to get delayed. And so it could cause a little bit of a backlog. That doesn't mean it's going to like wildly slow anything down, but things are currently shut down. The FDA cannot review new drug applications while they are shut down. And so it could likely delay everything. And well, we cannot speak on behalf of the FDA. We can talk about generalizations, how things normally operate, but the reality is there are going to be implications from the government being shut down. There has been a reduced workforce, and I know UniQure is going to do everything they can to work with all of the FDA's rules and regulations, which are a lot. It is a large federal organization, but to do things above board and correctly, it all does take time. But that's why we're hoping end of 2026 is a very realistic goal. And then regarding costs, cost is really hard to predict at this time because there isn't anything on the market for Huntington's disease. What we can go off of is other disease modifying drugs, other gene therapies that have been approved by the FDA. At this time, similar drugs cost between $2 and $4 million. One of the most similar drugs, another brain injection, is on the higher end. It's a $4 million procedure. So we can kind of get an idea from that. It's hard to know exact costs because we don't speak for the insurance companies. Will the insurance companies likely provide some coverage? Yes. But even if it's 20% of a $4 million procedures, that's still a lot of money out of pocket. Medicare does cover some of these things, but again, that's going to be a whole nother conversation. Once something like this is approved, once it's released to market, then Medicare is going to have a whole oh my God, negotiation. There's pricing negotiations that happen every year. So all of this is ongoing. All of this is really new. And a lot of the disease modifying therapies and gene therapies that have come out for other conditions, those are also really relatively new, like within the last 5 years. So this is something we're all dealing with. This is new for everyone. This is new for the United States. And when we're answering these questions, we're talking about it from the perspective of the United States. I cannot speak to cost and other places because that is not something that we're aware of. And it's brand new. Things when they are brand new are always more expensive. It's always most expensive when something is first released. And that is something that we do have to look at. And we are not the only players in this game. This is something Medicare has to look at. This is something drug companies have to look at. This is something that the health insurance companies have to look at. This is something that like the institutions that are providing this surgery have to look at. Because again, those are very specialized medical institutions. There are only so many across the country that can do this. And so all of these things get factored into cost. And it's impossible for us to predict right now. But is it something that is going to be easily accessible to everyone immediately when it is released? Unfortunately, the answer to that is no. And it is something we are going to have to continue working on and getting questions and getting more information because we just don't have enough information about all of these particular things at this time. And then another question that did come up, and Sarah did actually address this, is should I go out and get tested for HD right now? And I loved Sarah's answer. Sarah's answer was fantastic. She said no. And I wholeheartedly agree with that. And the reason for that, so as the senior manager of disability programs, I see the legal complexities of all of this. And as of right now, there isn't enough of a cost benefit analysis. Because with genetic testing, if you do test positive for Huntington's disease, you can be legally discriminated against in terms of insurance, in terms of certain aspects of employment. Like you can fight it, but discrimination does happen. And this is also a good thing to bring up because there are people who consider doing anonymous testing. In light of all of these clinical trials of AMT-1, like the benefits of AMT-130, getting anonymous testing isn't enough of a benefit anymore. So if you're seriously considering getting genetic testing done, it is better to do it on the record. But it's also really important to have the relevant conversations, understand what things could be impacted or changed. So can we say you're 22 years old, you want to just go out and get tested? We're not at that point. Sarah said we are not at that point. It is still a conversation that needs to be had. But as she said, as we move forward, as more drugs come to market, as there are more clinical trials, we get more results about everything, then that conversation is going to change. But we are not at that point yet where everyone should go out and get tested. It's important to have these conversations.
Thanks, Allison. Okay, so a lot of people are feeling, okay, if I can't go get tested and I can't get into the trial and I can't do anything right now, but like, what can I do? And so, Marianne, did you want to maybe talk a little bit about kind of, best course of action right
Yeah,
now?
absolutely. So we have actually a slide here, and this is just some of the organizations, advocacy support organizations as well that reach out to, find support, talk about this. I know for myself, I'm on a roller coaster ride of emotions, and I'm cautiously optimistic. I know so many people I love, this isn't going to help. But I do know that this could be potentially an option for so many people I do love as well. So I'm really, really hopeful, but I'm cautious and I'm reaching out to my support networks. And I think that's really important to know, like, that there are people to talk to, there are places to go to talk to others and professionals as well. I would say that the most important thing is starting to establish care. Dr. Waleed and Dr. Sarah talked about Enroll HD, which was how they um, the placebo participants that they received that information from. Enroll HD, participate, enroll. That's a way to also get into an HDSA center of excellence or an HD clinic, wherever you are, and to start establishing that baseline care and that conversation to start saying that you're interested in potentially, joining a clinical trial, and asking questions around it. Also, making sure that you sign up for HD Trial Finder. That way you're up to date with things that are potentially going on along with clinicaltrials.gov. And of course, myself, Tam, and Allison, our emails are up here. And we want you to know you could reach out to us with any questions.
And I do want to add on to that. I know Marianne definitely meant, like, she stressed going to get the appropriate care. And we really cannot stress that enough. Because with something like AMT 130, you can't just go to your primary care physician and necessarily get connected to the right individuals. HD is a rare condition that does require specialized treatment. So it is important to find the care team that works for you. That needs to include a neurologist. And it is really important to know, like, I am not a clinician, but I have read thousands upon thousands of pages of medical records in my time. You see things, you learn things. Like, not all neurologists are created equal, and that's not to be offensive to neurologists. There are sleep study neurologists. You don't want to go to a sleep study neurologist if you have Huntington's disease. That's not at all appropriate. There's movement disorder neurologists who specify or who study movement specifically. And yes, HD is considered a movement condition, but there's also the behavioral cognitive components of it. So you want to make sure you're getting the care that is reflective of all of these things. If you're seeing a movement disorder neurologist, but they're not treating your behavioral or cognitive care, then you're not getting all the care. And we understand that not everyone can go to an HDSA center of excellence because they're not all conveniently located. But that doesn't mean that there aren't neurologists closer to you that can provide wonderful care. The center of excellence neurologists are, in my experience, have been happy to work with other neurologists to provide comprehensive care. And there's no one saying you can't have multiple neurologists. A close one that you see more locally who can manage prescriptions, your drug treatment, like things on a more day-to-day basis, and then maybe seeing a more specialized neurologist once a year. But so many of these things work together. We're not supposed to stand alone. This is supposed to be a collaborative thing. And the more we all work together, the more that's beneficial for the things coming down the pipeline, figuring out what the next steps are for all of us. And I know we can't give concrete answers about everything because the reality is we don't know some of these answers right now, but we can't get there without your support and everybody continuing to work together and do all these fun things.
Well put, Allison. So I think that would be a nice way to conclude. I'd like to thank Dr. Walid Abisab and Dr. Sarah Tabrizi. Thanks so much for their insights. Thank all of you for tuning in and sending your questions. We know we didn't get to all of the questions. There were about 1,000 people on the call, and it just wasn't possible. But we have received them. We will try to get answers out to people, and please feel free, as Marianne said, to send any questions to these email addresses listed. And don't forget to lean on your other advocacy organizations and other research and education organizations, and the many resources available through the HDSA website. So thanks again for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.